The Ministry of Public Enterprises is in charge of state-owned entities, which are important for the economic development of South Africa. But together with some of its entities, Public Enterprises has been embroiled in one scandal after another, with its minister, Pravin Gordhan, often accused of ministerial overreach. Are these the repercussions of state capture, or is the department, its entities, prone to chronic leadership problems? Good evening. My name is Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, and welcome to the latest installment of Unfiltered. Tonight we ask, should the Department of Public Enterprises cease to exist sooner rather than later? Join me in welcoming our guests, Nabayomzi Kwankwa, a member of the Public Enterprises Portfolio Committee. We also welcome NUMSA spokesperson, Phakamile Hlubi Majola, as well as the currently suspended Director General of the Department of Public Enterprises, Mr. Kgothatso Tlhakudi. We also extended an invitation to the department, Eskom Board, Denel, and the SOE Council, none of which were able to join us in this discussion. But we hope you'll be able to join us. Please post your comments to Twitter using the handle @Unfiltered SABC. And before we dive into our conversation, let's take a look at this insert to give ourselves some context for the discussion.
This matter should be referred to the CCMA, or in this case it would in fact be to the MEIBC, so that the inquiry can go ahead, and your internal disciplinary inquiry may not go ahead until that process has run its course. And an employer says, well, I'm not going to listen to that, I'm not going to make the request. My Lord, then it's the employer has effectively hamstrung themselves.
Another scandal involving another state-owned enterprise. This time, the currently suspended CEO of Denel, Silo Ntsihlele, mounted a labor court case for his disciplinary hearing not to proceed. He alleges that he faces trumped-up charges after he made a protected disclosure against a senior official who allegedly attempted to influence a contract.
The disclosures that were made in relation to my matter in the company were protected, and as I understand from the legal point of view, the grievances that I had handed into the company contained those disclosures, and the disclosures that were made were not only limited to those grievances, but all the disclosures that were requested from me by other statutory bodies like the SIU, I would take it to constitute protected disclosures.
This is the latest in an endless list of scandals bedeviling state-owned enterprises. Recently, an ugly tension became public after the former CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, appeared on a television channel and in Parliament, alleging the involvement of senior politicians in crime at Eskom, leading to Enterprise Minister firing his own salvo against de Ruyter. De Ruyter has since gone to ground.
I think here what we have is a CEO who thought he was know-all, and he certainly hadn't worked in a power station situation before. So I refute any assertion and allegation about giving instructions.
In the midst of all this, questions remained about the probity of the SAA Takatso deal and the under-evaluation of the national airliner, in which a private equity partner was sought to hold 51% of the entity as part of its restructuring.
The sale of 51% of its shares to the Takatso Consortium, let me assure the public and honorable members that there has been absolute transparency in this process, and that all the necessary legal processes were complied with, notwithstanding the regrettable efforts by many to sabotage or undermine what is an important project in terms of recovering an SOE from the damage that was caused by state capture.
The Competition Commission has proposed the deal's approval by Labour Union NUMSA is demanding its cancellation.
The Ministry of Public Enterprises will cease to exist. It will cease to exist because the entities that are now overseen by the Ministry of Public Enterprises will revert back to their departments.
From allegations of victimization and intolerance to dissent by the currently suspended Director General of the department, Kgathatso Tlhagodi, to others who prefer to remain anonymous, the environment in the entities under the Enterprise Department is said to be toxic. The dire state of this department was also laid bare this year when the Auditor General presented a bleak picture of an entity to the Portfolio Committee. National Treasury says government has spent over 330 billion rands bailing out state-owned enterprises since 2013. Instead of being at the forefront of economic and social transformation, most SOEs have been associated with state capture, financial mismanagement, and major governance failures due to weak accountability and inefficiency. Eskom, Denel, Transnet, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, and the South African Post Service are a few examples of many struggling SOEs. While many argue that they are important to maintain as strategic state assets and for employment creation, others believe they should be privatized. In 2020, the President established the SOE Council to assess the role and mandate of SOEs. Minister Pravin Gordhan says his department is facing resistance by agents of state capture. But today we ask, is the task to retire the Enterprise Department long overdue? For Unfiltered, I'm Skhangiwe Mtiani.
Mr. Tlhagodi, thank you very much for joining us on Unfiltered.
Good evening, Sizwe, and thank you for inviting me to the show.
When did you first become aware that there was something awry, as you allege, with the Takatso deal?
This was early 2021. It was around January of 2021 when I started getting calls, strangely, from Mr. Novich, who is off lift, and also from the minister. Basically, the minister proposing that we need to bring Mr. Novich into the fold because obviously of his experience in the airline. And Mr. Novich started talking to me, including about interim management of SAA. And of course, that raised concerns because we had just run a process with RMB, which had produced two entities that they said the department would like to should take the discussions further with them. And there were other three entities that within the department that we had engaged. So we had 5 entities, and we had a meeting with the board of SAA, which had come in during the end of 2020, obviously intending to take over from the business rescue practitioners, whose time eventually came to an end on the 1st of April of 2021. And said, we have that process that is running now. How do I explain this process now that it is being said that it should result in Mr. Novich being brought in?
Right, so it was at that time that you were starting to get these calls outside of the 5 parties that had already been identified in a previous process. I mean, if that is true, as you allege, it seems highly irregular that a private player firstly would be calling you and then would be being supported by a minister outside of a process.
Yeah.
What did you do when you heard that? If it was so irregular that would call for extreme and emergency action, did you act soon enough?
Well, of course, it didn't end there. Later on, as we have come to know from the articles in the Business Times, Mr. Novich was introduced to Harith, and that's where Takatso came into being. And next thing I knew, we had this entity being brought into the department, being introduced by the minister as the preferred strategy equity partner for the entity.
And forgive me if I may.
If I can come to your question
yes,
now.
The question is, What did you do when you realized that something had gone awry?
Yeah. No, I raised these issues internally within DPE, where I said, obviously with both the colleagues and with the minister, by the way, as well. I have an email that I put together to the minister to say, we have a problem here, including obviously later on issues of valuation of SAA, which valuation did not make sense. So I raised these issues, and of course, strangely enough, this process continued. As you know, we had the entity Takatso being announced as a preferred strategic partner around June 2021, a process that happened without me. We also had the share sale and purchase agreement being signed in 2022 around February, also without myself being part of that.
When you say that the department alleges the Deputy Director General says you were there every step of the way, you're now belatedly raising these concerns, but you were an active participant in this process. How do you respond to,
of course,
to their response?
I've answered that question many times. That is not true. I led the process of oversight over the business rescue process during 2020. Beginning of 2021, which is around the time where I raised my concerns, another team was set up by the minister. That is the team that engaged Takatso. I was not part of that team. Of course, as the DG, they would come to me like they did with the share sale and purchase agreement at the end of 2021, and where they said, here it is, ready to be signed, because the powers had been delegated to me to sign up. I said, no, I can't sign this. I'm not comfortable with the terms that have been proposed here. The very same document that when in the beginning of 2022, I also gave the same feedback to the team that this document has still not improved. It does not, I believe that the state was overly exposed in how it was drawn up, including a requirement that by March we should have put 900 million rands into an escrow account controlled by Takatso. So we can't do that. We don't have the 900 million rands with the State Department. No, has the Treasury, is the Treasury going to provide these funds? I mean, money gets allocated through the budget process during specific times, obviously in the year. And when this document was signed in February, I took it up with the two DDGs that were there. We had two DDGs out of 7 in the department. I took it up with them and said, how do we have this kind of document signed, which is in direct violation of the PFM agreement? You can't commit the state without ensuring the source of funds. So that's what I'll say. And of course, as we have come to know, and as I have alleged, this whole transaction led to my being sidelined. Yeah.
And we'll come to more of those details, but let me bring in some of our other guests. Mr. Kwankwa, you have served on a role of public oversight. Do you think Parliament has done enough to inquire into this deal, which seems to be shrouded behind various excuses for a lack of transparency?
No, not at all. Thank you very much, and good evening to the viewers at home. No, not at home. Not at all. There seems to be no appetite on the part of the government to try and inquire into the scandal in particular. Recently, I think the meeting was postponed. Mr. Tlakuti will tell you that there was an attempt for the Public Enterprises Committee to sit and hear both sides of the story. But the meeting was postponed. I'm not too sure if it happened again. But it should not be such a serious matter of selling off a state asset such as SAA. Should not be left to an individual minister. But it should not be when there are alleged irregularities. Should not be left to one individual committee to actually inquire into it. I mean, in the past, when there were alleged irregularities in a number of departments, were able to establish ad hoc committees, which then would be able to sit and have dedicate their time to investigating matters of this nature. What we did is that when the matter was brought to the attention of the UTM, right at the beginning of the process, my leader wrote to President Cyril Ramaphosa flagging all of these irregularities. Obviously, from President Ramaphosa, all what we could get was an acknowledgement of receipt. It took it a step further. They wrote to Scopa and tried to get the minister and the department to account to Scopa. And even those responses were not satisfactory. In other words, it means we need to push harder to try and make sure that there is a commission of inquiry or a committee that is going to inquire into this, which would be a separate ad hoc committee. But as you know, the challenge obviously with that is that you can propose it, the ANC can shoot it down like it shot down the high-level panel report into the Pala saga.
Some analysts, just on that, Mr. Kwankwa, have actually alleged that the members of the committee, not just ANC members, but including them, haven't been well enough informed about these complex company law matters to ask the kind of probing questions that we need in Parliament. How do you respond to the lack of probing questions that we get, even when the minister actually is before the committee?
Remember, I think the challenge is that when you don't have a dedicated committee to inquire into these issues, it means the members of the committees have to actually manage their time because they've other multiple responsibilities. The committees might clash, and that might affect the amount of preparatory work that goes into it. But when you have a dedicated committee, such as an ad hoc committee, which has a clear time frame, then members are able to be taken from their committees to focus on that matter. It means the amount of preparation that they can do would be the one that is required, and that would enable them to ask the probing questions you're talking about. But also, I don't think it is fair to make sweeping generalizations and say all members of the committee. I think there are very good members of the committee who try to do their jobs, but you must remember that the limitation that from the governing party they face, they usually and generally always monitor the members of the executive when they appear before committees. There's no attempt to ask the difficult and probing questions that you're talking about, which then means or leaves or says to us that oversight is by its very nature then the purview of the opposition in our current setup. Now, if you don't have enough opposition MPs to be able to ask those difficult questions, you can't expect them to come from ruling party MPs because they actually have to worry about their bread and butter issues at the end of the day and not their allegiance to the constitution and party positions, obviously.
Let's leave it there for now. We've engaged with the current suspended DG members of Parliament. When we come back from the break, we're going to speak to NUMSA, who've been making very vocal comments, particularly about the SAA deal, and speak to spokesperson Pagamile Hlubi-Majola to get her views on the conversation. And so don't go anywhere. We'll deepen our conversation after the break. Welcome back to Unfiltered. Under the spotlight this evening, we discuss the question of the SAA Takatso deal that has caused much controversy. And before the break, we were speaking about parliamentary oversight. Ms. Hlubi-Majola, what's your view on this deal? NUMSA has said from the outset that it should be scrapped. You've been very vocal in your opposition to this deal. Do you maintain that this deal was, as you have put it in previous statements, the outcome of corruption?
Good evening, and good evening to your viewers. Thank you so much for having me on the program. I hope you can hear me.
Absolutely, loud and clear.
Okay, great. You are absolutely right. As NUMSA, we are vehemently opposed to this deal. In fact, we have been saying that it stinks of corruption. And there are many, many things that make us arrive at that conclusion. First of all, there is a complete lack of accountability from Minister Pravin Gordhan in relation to the so-called due diligence process that he followed in choosing Takatso as the equity partner. You know, you played that clip earlier where he says, I want to assure South Africans that this deal is above board. Unfortunately, those words are empty, because words without action based on evidence are meaningless. And all we have is the word of the minister. We have no idea what process the DPE followed in coming to the conclusion that Takatso was indeed the right equity partner. We have no idea who were the other bidders who tried to apply and were rejected and on what ground. We have no idea what the requirement that DPE needed in order to successfully choose who would be the bidding partner. And the more we dig, the more this deal stinks. If you look at, for example,
could I just ask you on that, because one of the things that has happened recently that has complicated the picture is that the Competition Commission has come out, and although it has raised certain obstacles to the deal, particularly the main shareholders, it has effectively given the green light for the deal. So that seems to be at odds with the idea that there hasn't been any scrutiny over this deal.
And this is part of our problem, which is why we issued the statement a couple of days ago condemning the Competition Commission, because we feel that they also failed in their duty to ensure that the public is actually given this type of crucial information. We actually met with the Competition Commission late last year when they were in the process of making a decision around whether they should approve this deal or not. And we were very clear that there were certain agreements that we needed in order to satisfy ourselves that this process was above board. We wanted the original sale agreement between the parties and any other agreements that they have agreed to. We also wanted confirmation that the PFMA process was followed. We didn't get any response from the Competition Commission in respect to the demands that we made. We got assurances from them that they would engage us prior to making a final outcome. We were shocked when they made the announcement to the media that they approved the deal and they had failed to come back to us in terms of what they had promised us for the details and the documents that we are demanding. So the Competition Commission has now become another player which has legitimized a process which was illegitimate to begin with. One of the most crucial questions we have to ask ourselves is, how is it that a consortium like Takatso is allowed to purchase an entity the size of SAA with subsidiaries like SAA Technical, Mango, etc., and yet it has no proof of capital? Where in the world have you ever heard of such a deal being acceptable on these types of conditions? And yet the Competition Commission and obviously DPE, and I would argue Parliament, seems to be comfortable with the fact that we can proceed with this process and not actually demand these answers. SAA is not a business belonging to Pravin Gordhan and company. It is a state-owned entity governed by an act. And in terms of that act, it is subject to the restrictions laid down by the PFMA. And the PFMA section 6054 is very, very clear about how you actually, like any assets of an entity, there's a process that you have to follow. That process, as far as we're concerned, has not been followed. And this is why we're saying that this deal stinks of corruption.
Right.
It's literally, this airline is literally being handed over to friends of the ANC at no cost, and there's no accountability from any of the bodies that are supposed to assist us to get these answers.
Let me also put that to you, Mr. Tlakudi, because in some ways this Competition Commission decision also comes as something of a blow to the statements you have been making. I think when people saw that the Commission, in this qualified way, in any way, gave the green light to the deal, it seems to complicate the picture. We haven't heard your response yet to that, and I wonder what you make of that.
Well, it came as a complete surprise. We also, myself and my legal representative, Tibbs, met with the Competition Commission, and from the discussion we had with them, there seems to be alignment that there are really some serious red flags on this particular transaction. So when the announcement was made that it has been given a green light, it was really a surprise, and we are seeking to also be part of the presentation of this deal to the tribunal, because we really want to understand what kind of analysis was undertaken here. The Competition Commission puts the condition to say the minorities must divest. Then we have news reports that come out where these minorities says we are not going anywhere. So it calls into question what happened here. We would have expected the South African public that when the Competition Commission put that condition and Takatso said the minorities will divest, that they will have at least formal notification of that from the minorities themselves. But that didn't happen. So it doesn't look like this was handled competently and professionally from where I'm sitting. And really, and the mandate of the Competition Commission as well is to ensure that they diversify this economy, they ensure that there's a broader number of players that are brought into, especially these kind of niche sectors such as aviation. But what we have here, we have literally, Mr. Novich entity and Global Airways, which obviously are historically advantaged entities, and Harith, which we know there's also question marks from the PSC inquiry headed by Judge Mpati. So one would have expected under that provision of ensuring a broader participation that the Competition Commission will have raised some very serious questions around the makeup of this consortium, which they didn't do. So I think they owe South African public a proper response.
Well, I suppose a lot of that remains to be seen in how that process unfolds over time. But I want to come to a wider question, because of course the Takatso deal is just symptomatic of a deeper malaise that seems to be spreading within the department when we talk about state-owned enterprises. Denel, one of the subsidiaries' CEOs recently now embroiled in scandal. We know what's happening at Eskom. SAA, do you think that there's a deeper crisis within the department from your vantage point and from where you're sitting now?
I think the AG's report to Parliament a few weeks ago laid out clear. It says we have a problem. We have an entity that is not meeting its own annual performance plan. From the time I was in the department, we did not have enough people, enough skills in the department. We had at senior manager level, we had almost 40% vacancy rate, which the minister seemed very reluctant to fill, by the way. So we are already constrained back then. So things have gotten worse, and the state of the entities have also gotten worse. So there's really a need for a proper analysis of what is going on there, and there's a need for proper governance process to be put in place such you don't find yourself in a situation where you have one individual that has so much power over what are public entities.
Absolutely, and we'll continue with this theme of the broader question of state-owned enterprises. I'll come to you, Mr. Kwangwa, after the break, because I'm interested in your views from the legislative perspective and the opposition perspective as well. We're discussing the SAA Takatso deal, but now deepening our conversation to a wider question of South Africa's state-owned enterprises. Are they in crisis, and what's behind this crisis? How do we dig ourselves out of this crisis? We'll deal with towards the end. Join us after the break as we continue this important conversation. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We continue our discussion on the Department of Public Enterprises, and we're talking about now a more generalized crisis across different public enterprises. Mr. Kwangwa, Denel, Eskom, SAA, Transnet, Post, I mean, the list goes on, and we might be here a long time if we list the crises that we seem to be in. To what extent do you think this is representative of a deeper crisis of leadership within the department, which has been alleged from internal voices within and also from political voices without?
It's not necessarily just the department alone. It points to a deeper leadership crisis in the government as a whole. Because remember, putting your SOEs together, the intention really was so that you could implement a developmental state model in a more coordinated fashion. But now what is happening is that there's a pillaging of SOEs right across the board, whether you're talking about South African Post Office, which is not under the department, as you mentioned earlier, whether you're talking about Transnet, that is under the Department of Transport and not under, for example, public enterprises, while PRISA is under public enterprises. There's a general, it's almost like the ANC government took a decision to say they're going to use state resources, rather SOEs, as a way to drain resources and divert resources to their own personal and petty projects, instead of being able to run the country properly. And one of the issues, without considering the leadership issue in the department and the fact that he spoke about a vacancy rate of 40%, but the issue for me is that each entity should fall under its line function. For example, it makes no sense that you are sitting with PRASA under public enterprises when you have the Department of Transport. It also makes no sense why you're sitting with ESCOM under public enterprises when you have the Department of Energy that should be actually overseeing its own entity. It got to a point where, because we are fed up even with public enterprises, for example, not with public enterprises, with public works, Parliament is also moving towards a system where they say we want to be able to look after our own asset, because once you outsource that, even though it's legal, we have to amend the laws. But once you outsource it, then people don't actually look after those entities. And the department itself, the line department, is not able to actually implement its strategy properly because some of its entities lie elsewhere. But the other issue here, even when you're looking at ESCOM, there's a culture of impunity. I mean, people steal money. We are told about endless investigations on state capture. Even the minister today in the budget vote on public enterprises, he was still blaming state capture. We are coming to the end of this government, this administration's term, and they are still blaming state capture. And yet they are not able to address the governance challenges that face these entities, which are always reflected and flagged by the Auditor General year in and year out. But people are still blaming ghosts because it suits them. I mean, no one is willing to actually look into the allegations that were made by Director besides just dismissing them outright. But the fact that you had someone who was running the entity for a while was able to make serious allegations against some of the people who are running the department, including some of the ministers, and you're not interested to inquire into that, it means you're building that culture of impunity. As long as you belong to the right faction, you will not be held accountable for actions. It depends on which side of the family you're sitting in order to be held accountable.
Ms. Hlubi Majola, the wider question of leadership, not only over public enterprises, but all state-owned entities, seems to be really occupying a lot of the debate at the moment. Do you think this is a question of the leadership within these entities? Do you think this is a wider question of leadership at the departmental level, at the ministerial level, at the presidential level?
I think there are various things playing themselves out at the same time. I think we definitely have a failure of leadership. Certainly that is NUMSA's position, that we've got a failure of leadership at the highest level, at the level of President Cyril Ramaphosa, who seems to have no idea, no plan, no clue about what is going on most issues most of the time, where he gives no direction, and we don't see a resolution to any crisis. When you look at load shedding, the state of ESCOM, when you look at all our SOEs, there is a crisis. But I think we also cannot ignore the two big issues. The one issue obviously being the rampant corruption of the governing ANC and how they have looted the state-owned entities for their benefit. I think this concept of state capture is one that NUMSA has certainly said we need to be more deeper in our analysis and stop allowing the likes of Pravin Gordhan and members of the media to distract us into thinking that state capture is a problem of only one faction of the ANC. State capture is a problem of the entire ANC. And if you look at it from that perspective, then the whole mess starts to make sense. But I think also we must also acknowledge that the decision that this government has taken to stop investing in state-owned entities, to stop maintaining them, to stop ensuring that they live up to their developmental agenda and to start privatizing them, that is also at the heart of our problem. Certainly when you look at ESCOM, the fact that we now are at stage 6 load shedding is because this government took a decision to stop doing proper maintenance of coal-fired power stations. They listened to the World Bank and the IMF, who said that they should privatize the entity. They introduced renewable energy independent power producers to the mix to provide energy. And those REIPPs, the only thing they're doing is draining ESCOM's balance sheet and not helping us with load shedding. So all of these issues, the failure of leadership, the corruption of the ANC, but also the senseless decision to privatize SOE, are all decisions that are starting to hurt us directly. And yes, as much as you might complain about how certain SOEs are governed. Certainly as NUMSA, we will be the first to tell you, and we can give you a long list of our problems within some of these SOEs. It does not mean that we should privatize them. They play a very important role. The privatization process that SAA has embarked on, which it's still embarking on even now, where they basically reduced the airline, dismissed 3,000 workers through retrenchment, has resulted in much higher prices for people who are flying. This has had an impact on small and medium enterprises that used to travel domestically. This has had a huge impact on domestic tourism. SAA, at its height, contributed 24,000 jobs along the value chain.
Okay,
now that agenda. Let me finish my thoughts.
I want to know. I have allowed you to but I must come in and intervene and allow different voices in the conversation. I want to continue this question that you've raised of privatization, and ask Mr. Tlakudi if indeed privatization has actually happened at the department, and what exactly was the valuation that was arrived at, because it all seems a little bit murky. How do you respond to this question of an agenda to privatize versus what the department has been saying about, you know, it's a little bit of privatization but not full privatization, and there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, as it were. What's your view of that question?
So we need to look at how we fund state-owned entities, and Ms. Luby has just touched on it. But by deciding not to fund these entities and improve their balance sheets, we say state capture has damaged them. But we decide, no, we are not going to provide the funds to fix them. In actual fact, by not funding them, we have made a policy decision. And that policy decision is that the entities, and obviously the ministry is responsible, must go outside of government to go seek funding from the private sector to augment the balance sheets of these entities. And of course, that means you have to give up equity. So in essence, we are privatizing by making those kind of decisions. So we can't, call them, we're just looking for a strategic equity partner. When you're giving control of an airline to a private entity, and government is no longer will no longer be a control, that is a privatization. So what is needed here, the governance framework that govern the SOEs, we need to look at them. Of course, the decision has been made that these entities will go to the aligned departments, but we need to have a code that will govern all these entities such that you do not have incidences like what has been referred to at ESCOM, obviously, where the CEO complained about the minister getting into the operations of the business. We have seen at ESCOM, Mr. Ntsihlele, the CEO at Denel Dynamics, saying that he has had to raise a grievance against the minister for coming in and interfering in an executive meeting. So you should not be having, the roles should be clear. What is the role of the minister as the shareholder? What is the role of the board? And the board and the executives should have that independence to be able to perform their role as the fiduciaries of these entities. But most importantly, we must have competent people. And unfortunately, what has been the norm is that we parachute people from outside of these entities. When you have people that have been working on these entities for many years, for decades, that could be given an opportunity to run the business because they understand the business, they understand the sector. And from our own analysis of entities, state entities that have been successful around the world, you find that you have people that have grown in the organization that are ultimately assumed the top role. So those are some of the questions that we answered when we put together a framework that will govern all the entities, regardless of where they report to.
Absolutely.
The government.
And we're going to come to some more questions about where to from here. An interesting conversation has been opened up about the wider policy direction and the move to privatize certain state assets. We'll continue that conversation and then ask each of our guests where to from here, what would they do, and how do we extricate ourselves from this malaise. Stay tuned to Unfiltered. See you after the break. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're discussing state-owned enterprises and South Africa's crisis. Ms. Hlubi Majola, before we left, we began a debate about the wider policy direction. And I'd like to ask you, what's your view on the solution from here, particularly around state-owned enterprises and their position in government? One of the things we've heard from Mr. Kwankwa, who I'll come to thereafter, is SOEs in this department are just awkwardly placed. They should all be placed under line functions. So I guess that's one proposal. What would you propose to resuscitate our ailing state-owned enterprises?
Well, we definitely do need the SOEs to be aligned according to their line function. It really doesn't make sense that they're all under, or the majority of them anyway, are under the umbrella of state-owned enterprises. The vision that NUMSA has always had, which we've articulated at many different times, even directly with ministers, is that the way these SOEs should operate is that they should actually support each other. So, in other words, if you're looking at aviation, the aviation should support the hospitality and tourism sector, and also, deepen the transportation. Eskom obviously playing its, crucial role that it does of providing electricity to all entities. At the same time, there should be a way where, and in fact, I think it was one of the proposals we made where we were discussing the challenges that Denel faced. We said that Denel and SAA, certainly SAA Technical, should be working closer together, because there's a lot of areas where they sort of come together in terms of how they operate. But we've not seen that, unfortunately. And what's worsened the situation is the senseless decision to privatize SOEs. They are privatizing Eskom through the fact that they've privatized energy generation, the fact that you have the private sector now supplying energy through the REIPPs is privatization of Eskom. And the unbundling of Eskom also is a way that the IMF takes you deeper into privatization. And all of that is not beneficial to us. We've seen that ever since the private sector has gotten more involved in energy generation, we're paying higher tariffs. Eskom last year, when they were presenting to NERSA regarding the tariff increases, confirmed that part of the reason the tariff increase has gone up so much is because of the impact of the REIPPs and the cost of renewables. So we know this, not just in South Africa, but anywhere in the world. Anytime that the private sector gets involved in provision of services, the cost of those services go up, because the private sector's motive is profit. They're not interested in development. They don't care if the indigent and the poor can't afford electricity. What they care about are their shareholders.
Okay.
So we need to get back to the original mandate that these SOEs were created for, which was to empower and improve the economy, but for the benefit of the majority of people, not just for the sake of driving a privatization agenda, which will only enrich and empower a minority of people.
Right. Mr. Kwankwa, so the line function question seems to have been in some ways agreed. It's hard to know where the policy stands from the government. The SOE Council was mooted to drive greater coordination. It sounds like there's some agreement on at least some of the statements government has made. So we agree then that government is taking the right stance. What's the problem then with the stance the government has taken? Or is it the
the issue has always been the political will to follow up on those statements and policy positions that have been taken. I want to give an example. The Presidential Infrastructure Review Commission took a decision, made a recommendation as far back as 2013, saying there needs to be a framework that governs SOEs. It doesn't matter where they are, in which department they are, but a framework that can govern SOEs, which is what Gabudi was talking about earlier, to say that is required from a policy point of view. If you read the annual performance plan, the report of Parliament, which was evaluating the annual performance plan of the department for this year, the report laments about the fact that the shareholder management bill, which was supposed to be doing that, which was a decision taken as far back as 2013 when I first became an MP, has not come to light. There has not been no shareholder management bill that has been introduced to Parliament. There has been no progress on that because there's no appetite on the part of members of the executive to get these SOEs properly regulated because they run them as their own fiefdoms. Hence, there's the interference you're talking about. Since it is ludicrous, I think actually preposterous for me, that you can have a government that does not want to have energy independence. Recently, I had the privilege of paying a courtesy call when we were doing parliamentary duties to the president of Azerbaijan in Baku. One of the first things he stressed, he said, you can't have economic independence without energy independence. You need both. And he said, once you privatize, which is something that we've been saying for the longest period, once you privatize your energy generation in the country, it means you become very vulnerable to the interest of the private sector in particular. But also remember, where I don't understand the thinking of government on this question. President Ramaphosa keeps on talking about making sure that there's transmission. ESCOM must play in the transmission process. It's like you or me celebrating owning a pipeline from Zimbabwe to Malawi, but without having influence in the supply of fuel. It's nonsense. It turns you into a price taker instead of being able to influence the price of an important product such as electricity. That means most of our people are going to move back to using paraffin and all of the other things because they can't afford it. The other problem here is that there seems to be an agenda to try and run all SOEs to the ground so that they can be privatized. I mean, firstly is that if you are black and you are competent in these SOEs, you are going to be ill-treated to the point where you leave. But if you are white and incompetent, like Director, for an example, who served more like a prosecutor than the CEO of the entity, whose press briefings were not convincing, and we said that this a long time ago, but because he was white, no one complained about that fact. And guess what? The irony is, Director who contributed to the destruction of ESCOM is now going to make money out of it via the scandals and the exposés that he's making. The very same person who contributed to running the entity to the ground. And by the way, it's the media that is quiet when Minister Gordhan actually sets a foot wrong. It's the media that is quiet when people like Director, for example, are not doing what is expected of them. But when we had people like Brian Molifes in the past, they would complain at the drop of a pin. If they had done something wrong, it would turn into a scandal and not consider the bigger picture of what they were contributing to the entity. So it's a problem that the ANC government does not seem to have a political will to address the challenges that are faced by SOEs. And I don't want to sound like I'm being pessimistic here, but I think the situation is going to get worse as we go to elections, as they look for funding because they are not able to get funding from the private sector because of rampant corruption that takes place in the ANC and its government.
Mr. Tlakudi, the proposal from the ANC, at least in some periods, is without much action yet, is to dissolve the department. Do you think, having been there, having served right at the center, that is a wise move?
What we had, Caesar, was a half-pregnant situation. Remember, the Department of Public Enterprise was what used to be called the Office of Privatization under the old regime. And the entities that were transferred to PE were intended to be privatized. And that process, obviously, with the new government or the new dispensation coming in, was stopped. So we ended up with this entity that, in actual fact, was was an anomaly within the rest of government. So if around the world, you have governments that have centralized government shareholder management. You have others that have rather left that within the line departments. I think what is important is, have proper regulations such that these entities do not unfairly benefit because now they are owned by the policy department or they are reporting to the policy department, so that we can still have the rest of our economy, which is the private economy, be able to function. So that's what you want. And then there's been a reference, obviously, earlier to the Presidential SOE Council, and we have some great brains in that council, and I'm sure they will be able to resolve this particular question for us. I think, regardless of which way we go, there are enough examples around the world where both models have been successful. So I'm sure with the right leadership, we can also achieve the same outcomes.
Mr. Kwankwa, some final thoughts from you on dissolving the department, and just any final thoughts that you can wrap up with in the final minute or so?
Well, the final thought is that people mustn't. The only solution is getting rid of the ANC government in 2024 so that you can get a political party that will be committed to resolving the challenges and improving the service delivery record of government. Otherwise, as things stand, we're going to go to blackouts, go through led from one crisis to another because of leadership failures in the ANC. I mean, they've tried their best over the past 30 years or so, and they've failed dismally.
Ms. Hlubi Majola, we'll end with you. Your final concluding thoughts in a minute.
I do think that at the end of the day, our biggest crisis, unfortunately, is the ANC government, and NUMSA has been very clear on that they lack vision, that they've given up on themselves and they've given up on this country, which is why they have no solution. So I think it's really important with the elections that are coming up next year that people think about the suffering that they've undergone and they vote wisely.
Thank you very much to all our guests this evening for joining us. We'll, of course, have further conversations on this question from multiple perspectives. Join us on social media at Unfiltered SABC, and we look forward to hearing from you there. Have a good evening, and we'll catch you on the next installment of Unfiltered. Thanks for joining us.